It is my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Liu as our next speaker here. She is a senior IT audit manager at Wells Fargo, currently manages a team of 12 staff members over identity and access management, network security domains to deliver risk mitigation recommendations that are long-term oriented and root cause focused. She's enjoyed over 15 years of progressive career journey by driving process improvement, operational excellency continuously. MBA from Metropolitan State University, working on the MS in cybersecurity from New York University, and has a host of professional certificates in IT risk management and related areas. It's my great pleasure to welcome Catherine Liu to give her presentation at this time.
Thank you so much. It's my great honor to be here. So, it does not work. Obviously, I don't know how to use this. Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Awesome. All right. So, as introduced, I'm senior audit manager from Wells Fargo and been working in the IT operations and risk management for over 15 years. But set aside the title, what I really like to introduce myself is I'm a team coach. And so on a daily basis, I lead my staff and really navigate really unique situations and think about the risk landscape and contributes to the company baseline. And then I'm also a cheerleader. Lots of difficulties on a daily basis, and then how do we solve it together, and then crossing the finish line. And then I'm also a change catalyst because a lot of my team's finding really drives the culture change from the company, how to think about the risk and how to make our control environment go stronger. And of course, I'm a lifelong learner and I'm a big fan of the national park, and I just hiked the 46 out of the 63 national park this summer and in Alaska. And I also invent my own recipes over the weekend, and I'm a proud dog mother. That's my beloved dog, Cuddy. So the structure of my presentation today is I'm gonna navigate through, kind of piggyback to what we've been discussing throughout the day today, and say, how do you think about the risk factors throughout the organizational environment, and then what does that mean in terms of different lens of defense kind of perspective, and also from the internal audit perspective, how do we contribute to the cybersecurity? And we're gonna walk through a few examples and how do we scope our engagement, and then what are the key lessons learned, and also what drives the scoping decisions when we're doing our work. And finally, I'm gonna hone in for a lot of case studies and how we solve those cyber risk management challenges and risk assessment process. So one benefit of talking in the late afternoon is those people ahead of me already dive in deep about all those risk factors, and so I can skip a lot of talking points. And no surprise, human factors, right? And how do we evaluate the insider threats? And are we nationwide? And we're pretty much also having the quiet quitting. That is a phenomenon. So how does that really impact the IT operations, IT security, cybersecurity, and also how does that tie to the risk emerging threats as a new indicator? And also, the humans gonna drive the company culture. If you are having some issues as an organization for tone at the top, or if you have the leadership that has been really cut corners of the good controls, trying to squeeze out every extra dollar for the profit, that could be some of the human factors you should also look into as well. And also third-party risk. And we all know that from like 2021, beginning of 2021, we have another big scale data breach from LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook for over 200 million user records has been released. All three big companies using the same vendor called SocialArc, and that is where the link has been kind of hacker utilize that vendor connection and then steal the data from all three big tech companies. And emerging threats, as I mentioned, there's some kind of like human factors play into it, and cyber war, and also more and more companies will begin to look into the cryptocurrency attacks in our company environment. Business change. Many good controls can go invalid, irrelevant, or no longer as effective with the business structure change and the business model we do. Technology change, more and more companies migrating to the cloud. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the data transferring, encryption? And so we need to be aware of those technology change. Regulatory, GDPR, CAPP, and so all those new regulations are impacting the company. So when we're evaluating our risk assessment process with a good framework, we also need to think about what are the risk drivers unique to our company environment, so we can really zoom in to the high-risk areas. So Dr. Bill already talked about the 3 lines of defense earlier. So many of us are very familiar with the first line defense functionality, all those cybersecurity, the common job titles you can find in the first line: incident response and SOC, and process automation architecture, and then threat intelligence, threats hunting, blue team, red team. Those are all in the front line. So what is their character? Means they are the people on a daily basis directly handling and combating the cyber risks. And they are the risk owners and also mitigating the risk. But on top of that, we also have, for a very mature environment, we should have really sound second line of defense as well. Those are the people who draft the company policy, IT security policy, and they check for the compliance and also the governance, set up the governance structure and do the metrics reporting. And many times you also see the application security function lay in the second line, because the DevSecOps and many of those functions security right now, they try to lay it and realign it with the second line of defense to maintain that independence. Also, they perform the risk assessment, and when we're having the issue mitigation, many times the second line also chime in for the independent issue validation to make sure that the control has been addressed to the root cause. Finally, it comes to internal audit. We are called the third line of defense. We perform independent assurance testing. Means for company environment, if you have control, we step in to evaluate that control design, if it was adequate, and if it's operating effectively, try to, if those control really achieve the goal and objective it's supposed to be. And we also providing the consulting services. A lot of those are really anticipating the risk. What are the emerging threats? And when the company is embarking on a new initiative, we often have a seat at the table providing that advising role. And we try to help them think through what are the risk factors here and how to make their control environment strong, instead of coming after the facts, after you already deployed those controls, say, you know what, you have a control gap here. And so basically, how internal audit, we directly report to the board of the audit, and then which provides which is very important link to the company oversight structure. So this is another way to look at how we really chime in for the cybersecurity environment. As I said, assurance, right? We look at the core process and then start with the highest risk, because there's always a cost of balance to evaluate everything and put in controls. You cannot control every single thing. So that is we take the same approach. We look at what is the highest risk in the environment and then starting addressing those areas first, and then help the company assess if those processes are strong enough to mitigate the risk. And so advice, and then so as I already talked about our role, chiming for advice during the process change, and then anticipate, we are pretty much trying to alert the company what are the next dangerous things coming around the horizon. So we also providing that education role during the process. And regarding how we do our work, we're more than workshop. Traditionally, internal audit, we utilize the sample-based approach, heavily focused on sampling. We still do that, but more and more the industry, we're kind of like also embarking on the data analytics routes, and we're embarking on the artificial intelligence solutions, and we try to provide our own modeling to perform that continuous monitoring of the business risks. So a lot of those testing right now we do are based on the automated model, and we identify the anomalies, which will alert the business team. So that, I have a use case later on to talk about how we do that. Now, talk about the skills. This is where the interesting thing came in, because we pretty much learn how to do the right thing at the same time while the front line of business learning. So that's why I say, who's gonna check the checker, right? And we have a lot of study performing for the front line of defense and what is your maturity model. But for the third line of defense, I see maturity all over the place. And are we having the right skill sets? Are we really understand the business? Especially, we are looking at so many things. Our horizon stretched 1 mile wide, and many times only 1 inch deep. Of course, we have a lot of SMEs in those areas. Like me, I'm aligned with the IAM domain, and then also with the network security domain. But not every single auditors have those equivalent knowledge in those areas. So we are wearing multiple hats. We need to think from both the bad actor's perspective, also think from the protective person's perspective, to think what could be the risk factors, how could we attack certain business and technology piece, and then how do we protect it? So that is the knowledge we need to have in that area to perform and also help the business as we need to. And then final thing, let me just make a highlight of, we are also trying, when we are communicating the audit finding, we try to really do the action-focused recommendation. We need to really make those high-impact reporting. We bring forward with the business what is the highest risk, why does it important, make a lot of sense to your environment when we're giving the recommendations, and so we give them the concrete recommendation they can work upon. So this is some of the example of when we are performing the cyber audit assessment, different workshop have different kind of like scoping strategy. And for Wells Fargo, we have internal document called IT Audit Framework, where we just basically lay out all the IT domains we need to look into and map it against the auditable entity, which means the business functionality areas in the company environment. And then that audit framework is also horizontally mapped to the NIST framework, mapped to ISO requirement. For banking industry, we're heavily focused on the FFIEC methodologies and also the framework. So it's FFIEC and data privacy. So what Dr. Bill talked earlier regarding that data mapping, we're doing something very similar. And that is one vehicle we use to provide the audit coverage from different teams. We're taking the we're taking big or small subcomponents from that methodology coverage, and then we perform our work. So what I provided here are some of those scope snippets from the KPMG, because those are publicly available information. And as you can tell, many of those things we do, we probably don't do it much different in nature from how the front line is really performing the risk assessment. Like, we will still looking into how the vulnerability scanning and penetration testing is being performed. We look at how those decision-making are drive for those sound penetration testing. Like what Dr. Bill said earlier, that a lot of those pen testers, they stop at the first exceptions, the first vulnerability they identify, and then they stop there. So how do they perform those pen testing? Is those methodologies thorough enough? Are those exception findings funnel into the next year's architectures refresh, review, and how does those information really kind of like utilized by the organization to improve the security posture? Those are the areas we look into, but with a slightly different lens and perspective when we're tweaking our work. also talk about, say, another thing I want to highlight is the IT governance piece, because we are the checker, right? So many times when we're looking at the organization, it's not like they don't know what to do. It's actually we're having some misalignment of the roles and responsibilities. Like when we're looking at how comprehensive is the cyber assessment policy line up in those organizations, some of those components are completely missing. Nobody touch it. Nobody talks about it. People know there might be some issues there, but nobody's owning it. That is a typical example when we're having those governance, roles, responsibilities not aligned with those functions we need to look into for those organizations. So we auditors call those things out. And I have another example down the road and explain about that. So talk about some of those key lessons learned or considerations when we're doing our work. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but just some of those kind of like highlighters say, when we are doing our work, what are the things we should keep in mind? Number one, we need to have a comprehensive plan. This should not be a cherry picking. It's so easy for internal audit just to do those kind of like cherry picking work and taking credits from the low hanging fruits. And if we want to be a valuable partner to the business and to really look at the cybersecurity risk comprehensively, we need to really map our methodology. How do we perform our coverage, our testing to a solid framework? As I said, for Wells Fargo, we have that internal framework, trying to map it to the NIST CSF and also ISO. So we make sure that each domain and relevant factors, we're having some coverage and audit procedures lay behind, so we can take those domains consideration, translate into actionable items. Another thing I already made is prioritize the risk. Once the bigger the organization, the harder it is to really chew everything at the same time. So we need to prioritize. We need to do our work in layers and in phases. And a typical example is, say, for example, you know what? Let me save it for the case study, but just have that kind of like in the back of your mind. And we don't have to do everything all at once. We develop some methodology to look at the things in the staged focus, so we can address those kind of challenge little by little, but still give the chance for the environment, for the business to mature up before we come back again. Audit plan is living and breathing documentation. And for example, if we, in the middle of this year, my company and for my domain, we are pretty much overhaul our entire reporting system for the IAM reporting system to another data warehouse. And so we pretty much chime in for the middle of the year and immediately look into the system design. Are we extracting the data in the right way? Are we designing the query in the right way? And of course, we find some defects in the middle of the implementation, so we're able to catch those defects before things are fully into production. And talent requirements is so hard to imagine that, I mean, we hire so many people from the IT degree, and then, but still, that's another challenge that we as industry want to bring to the kind of awareness of the education and seek collaboration of how we can also enhancing the curriculum, right? Because many students, they have the awesome IT knowledge, but when we're really looking at the risk and say what could go wrong, and people can look at some of the flawed IT process and think it has all the good elements of what a good control is supposed to look like. So we are the auditors that kind of wearing multiple hats. So we are also trying to train the people to basically understand why certain things are more risky and how to use that same methodology to think through the different scenarios. And I think I mentioned about how we help the organization mature over time, and then also reporting the risk to the board of directors, timely, make high impact audit report. And also, we utilize a lot of data analytics to drive those decisions and the risk evaluation. And finally, this is a people's work, right? IT security and cybersecurity, human factor is a big component, and so as those people who try to address those risks. And we constantly collaborate because, for example, if we look at the data from an exception perspective, we cannot gain that data without really going through the front line. They are the data provider. So we need to have a good relationship with them. But at the same time, we're the people who's checking their work. We sometimes point out the baby is ugly. So how you really kind of like strike in that balance and build that collaboration and also open-mindedness and trying to shift their mindset. Certain things are not good enough, but we can do something to make it better. And that is the key of our work. And one example would be we are actually, for the recent privileged access engagement, we pretty much find out for the our definition of the service account are very narrow. They only define it as an infrastructure layer. So the entire application layer, nobody look at it, nobody owning it, nobody performed the risk assessment. So right now we're trying to redefine what a service account is supposed to look like. Again, it sounds like for a big environment, we should be much ahead of the curve for that, right? But no, there's still a lot of maturity for every single organization to catch up. So right now we're beginning to look into those accounts making the API call, and those accounts that are utilized by the bots, and those accounts that drives the stored procedures. All those things, we began to redefine what a scope is supposed to look like, and to know what we're supposed to know, bring to the inventory. Then we can say, what is the security policy supposed to look like? How do we manage the risk? So those are the conversations my team enable and open the door with the line of business so we can address those issues together. And now finally is a very fun part. And so of course, we're the practitioner, right? We're there to address those challenges, and each environment, each business have those very unique challenges. So let's look at some of those common ones. And what are some of those examples? There's no right or wrong. It's just some samples to provide the thought-provoking process, so we can see how different organizations are utilizing those concepts to address those problems. Number one, when you are having a really large organization, is it possible to provide an end-to-end audit coverage on all the cyber risks? So the case number one, I'm going to give it to you, is actually, so I'll say several thoughts I see as like the common theme. You need to have a solid plan, and then you need to have basically be able to walk through and build the business knowledge to walk through the process from end to end, also system end to end. And then from the horizontal level, if your team is big, if your organization is big, you need to utilize different sub-teams to collaborate with that work, and how does that collaboration supposed to look like? And also, if you are SME for a certain domain, and what does that deep dive supposed to be? So let's start with number one, macro planning. So many years ago, when I was hired at one bank, and the environment is a little bit less mature, pretty much there's some of the findings from their regulatory entity that they plan their audit at a very high level. There were only 7 buckets where they drive the entire IT audits, and say, for example, big buckets like network security and the change management and IT governance. And so the thing is, with that big domain, it's really hard to decide where to start. And when you especially have a really small workshop with limited resources, you easily scratch the shallow surface, or do not have a comprehensive coverage to look into everything you need to look into. So the first thing we did was pretty much look into what are the relevant framework. And we pretty much picked the FFIEC framework, because that is really geared towards the banking industry. So the first thing I did was mapping that existing 7 buckets to the FFIEC framework. That already break it down to the 22 framework, 22 domains, and which is more granular. Then with that granular domains, I began to talk to IT team one by one. And I say, does those process related to our banking environment? And how do we utilize those process here? And what are the key controls and systems in place? And what do you think is our risk? And what keeps you awake at night? So by doing that exercise, we actually further break down that 22 buckets into entire 47 sub-process or auditable functional areas. And the IT people also gave me their rating about what are the risks, and if those critical systems are breaking down, and what are the classification of those critical systems, and then what could be the impact. So I drive that risk score by that conversation with IT people. Then I went back to the IT audit workshop and examined the past year's IT audit history. And then I began to formulate, say, based on our past audit finding, how should those risk score being addressed and adjusted? And what are the areas we never ever perform any audit coverage or visibility there? Because visibility is the enemy of security. Invisibility is enemy of security, right? So from there, and now I have a game plan, say what are the relevant area and what are the risk rating. Now, look at the audit cycle. I have very limited resources. So I need to stretch that audit frequency from 3-year cycle to 5 years. Now, because of that 5-year cycle, for like say the network security, and for those high risk rating, I can guarantee at least 2 subdomains I'm gonna hit every single year. But then over the time, I'm gonna kind of rotating and then hitting every single bucket in that 5-year cycle. But then, for example, like the network security, year 1, I'm gonna look into the firewall and network architecture because nobody ever evaluated that. Year 2, I'm coming back for the vulnerability assessment. Year 2, I'm looking to the incident response capability. And from the governance area, nobody ever looking to that area because that is people are so focused on the IT operations audit. Nobody looking to the metrics and reporting and visibility from the management and leadership's perspective. So I say, year 1, this is my plan. I'm gonna evaluating if for all those security domains, do we have a policy and standards, baselines in place? Do we even have those expectations laid out there? And then if I have any audit findings, I give you 1 year to fix it. Year 2, I'm coming back. And I say, now, I'm evaluating for that IT procedures and also the standard operations playbook aligned with supporting your capability, kind of like operational objective and also the baseline expectation. Year 3, I'm evaluating your control self-assessment capability because now you have the expectation, you have the tool, you have the step, and now where's your control? You lay out those control and perform those self-assessment about your control environment maturity. So those are all transparent game plan. I make that plan and give it to the line of business people so they know what we're looking at, so they understand why we're asking certain questions, and they can start preparing and do those proactive work before I come back and give them, say, the assessment, audit finding work. This is where we formulate that collaboration. So this is an example of when you are having a very immature workshop, there's nothing there and how you could potentially lay out a kind of comprehensive coverage and with that game plan to help you address those risks layer by layer. And the second case is, when I also work for that company and for the first company, and we actually, we're looking at the disaster recovery process. And I talk to the manager, I say, I don't think your critical application will be able to restore in time in case there's a major disaster. Why? Because those applications depending system, it take a longer time for those kind of allowed time for this application to restore. And the management was kind of like, what are you talking about? Because at that time, nobody was talking of people, this is how people typically review for the disaster recovery. We classify the criticality of those applications. If this is mission critical application, we say it needs to be restored within 2 hours, within 4 hours, within 12 hours. And then people begin to establish procedure. How can we meet that timeline and then exercise their capability and practice their capability to meet that timeline? They haven't think about is if those system, if you are just isolating those systems in their individual box, and of course you're able to restore it in time. But if you're depending on some mainframe, it takes 24 hours. And guess what? Your front web-facing application will not be restored, and people will not be able to do business with you. Unfortunately, 3.5 years ago, Wells Fargo ended up in the newspaper. This is when I give the other management this audit findings, that was not with Wells Fargo. But I wish I was there, because Wells Fargo's one major data center went down for the exact same reason. We were not able to restore in time. And right now, what did Wells Fargo do? For every single application, we not only classify the criticality and then what is the expected timeline of that application restore time, we also trace it back for all the data flows for those depending systems, all the way to, we identify every single upstream data dependency, and then we also quantify and evaluate if their risk, if their restoring time is within the still align with those downstream systems restoring time. And if we're finding that the aggregated total restore target is really above this downstream system restore target, that's the exception. We think about how to resolve the bottleneck to fix it. So this is how you need to look into those critical IT process. Same thing with the cybersecurity. If you are really looking to your, incident tracing capability, trace it to the very end, trace it to the very front, where information coming from and how those information are passing around to the team who handling. How do we know those things are handled in time? With that goal in your mind, trace it all the way to the end, provide end-to-end process analysis. This will help you identify where's the bottleneck, where's the blind spot. Another example, and horizontal coordination. Big organization, simply for the IAM, and my team, we cannot provide that coverage. And what we did was, is we published the standard audit procedure for general user access. So when the line of business auditors, they come to the field, they evaluate each application, look at the segregation of duties, and look at how the user authenticate to the application, how the user management is being performed. They are my ears and also eyes, and trying to see what's going on with the individual application by application, because this is their responsibility. Now, if those applications do onboard to the centralized IAM solutions, my team chime in, because we dive in for the system interface, and we test the data connection, we test the data logic, how each single application step is being performed. We test that to the T's. So now we're having a collaboration between those IT team and the frontline, the business auditor team, so we can look at the entire thing from end to end, and also making sure we're looking at the things very consistent across different teams. Finally, deep dive. And this is where the domain SME auditors come in, because for a mature workshop, we try to, not only you have the horizontal knowledge of what's the general risk supposed to look like, we also try to have those people who can really perform the subject matter support for those area. And like taking privileged access as an example, we pretty much look into every single platform the bank is utilized. So for each of those platform, Windows and Unix, and then workstation, and then middleware and mainframe. Yeah, we're still using mainframe. And we try to look into what are the temporary privileged accounts being granted. What is their business process? And then for those persistent privileged accounts, those people who always gonna have the access to your system, we also look into that, how those secrets, because we use the password vault, right? How those password checking process look like. And when we're having those different systems connected to the reporting capability, how those data flow from those source system where we do the provisioning all the way to the reporting capability. And so how do we guarantee the data are being reported accurately? So those are the areas when you go through IT domain by domain, like the incident response, and when you go for the network boundary defense, you can go for the deep dive. So from this kind of like the matrix perspective, this is how a big organization can provide the comprehensive coverage there. So, but this is just one way how my workshop has been doing it, but different team has, and overall, IT audit workshop, we're still lack of a lot of maturity. We many times throwing darts in the darkness, and we try to do our work right, but if there's any frameworks that really help us evaluating how do we do our work right, that'll be awesome. So let me quickly go through the remaining two challenges. So another thing is oversight. I think I briefly talked about this as well, and this is one of those areas highly, highly gray, because you do not have good governance structure, you do not have all the downstream cybersecurity hygiene, nothing. So the challenge that we were facing at that time is, especially for banking industry, you acquire so many business, and you just acquire all those applications. And am I good? 1 minute. So what we do is for those applications, if you're a new application, and then we try to establish those sunrise process, making sure that the policy adherence is definitely part of the security toolkit. So you don't go to production unless you complete the sunrise. And then when you're doing those sunrise, you are actually doing those still taking IAM as an example, and you are doing those IAM pre-boarding checklist. Once you're going through those checklists, it gives you different scenario of what solutions are supposed to be used by you, so you can make sure you are onboarding to at least one of those enterprise approved solutions, which has been highly vetted by the different assessors and things like that. And for those parallel controls, means if you are not able to perform the centralized onboarding, we at least, this is Band-Aid and stop bleeding going forward, right, for new application. For the historical one, we, based on the application criticality, we filter out all those critical applications, and one by one, which applications we can onboard to the centralized solution, and which one eventually, because of the uniqueness of the application, we cannot. Then how do we establish parallel control locally with the same strengths as if they are almost with a centralized solution? So we're also established that kind of so-called trust framework, so we can vetting the control strengths, and when we're having that, we can also tie back, say, what is the risk exposure for this particular business line? So we do that risk calculation, trying to measure it visually. And finally, when you're so busy with doing your daily work, and then how do you bring that visibility to proactive? Because proactive is always the key. It's always gonna be cheaper than fixing the issue. With the next 0 day, we don't know when will be the big victim and ended up in the newspaper for the next 0 day. But what we can do is prepare several thoughts. And number one is data-driven analytics. And a specific example, let me think. For example, like say, I'm only gonna pick one example now. So for the quiet quitting, right, we're talking about, that is a behavior change. Earlier with the panel and David, we talk about how do we trace that human factor with those kind of like, how do you predict? And the behavioral change, especially with the human. And at that time, the leadership is like, I don't even know if those applications are being tested on time, being tested sufficiently. And we're like, there's no way we can know if it's being tested sufficiently. So we utilize a different factor. Just like David said, everything that if it's human touches, it's gonna be some way to correlate. We think about motivation. We think about what could be the attributes because of that motivation. And statistically, earlier this year, we have that kind of industry survey. Nearly 50% of those IT people, they say they don't know the applications installed in the production has been behaving the way it's supposed to be or not. That means they're not actively maintaining it. They're not actively really trying to monitor it. So we look into the incidents trends. We draw a large population of the incidents, and then we classify those incidents, and then we zoom in for those applications that has the highest incidents right after production implementation. Which means if they are not testing it sufficiently, they're not testing security. And then we correlate to who are the application owner. Turn out to be those applications that have highest number of incidents belong to that several application owner. It's always their application not tested sufficiently. So we think about what could be the motivation, what could be the behavior attributes when you're having certain kind of human factors, and then we try to build a smart test case that way. And then the final one, the Log4j, which is all over the news, right? And the biggest challenge is the source of the records. And when you're having components, utilizing the components and utilizing the Log4j logging capabilities, and it's really hard for any organization to really trace. And then other than just start with the PAA, public accessible application. And so that is something I actually, also for the time being, I want to call out for actions, because the source of records is always the biggest challenge for IT security monitoring, and also for the audit workshop as well. We don't have a centralized source of records, and then how do we identify those embedded risks are things that I'm really gonna call out for all of you research people, and just provide those insights, and then help us build a more smooth, kind of like streamlined, centralized repository of records. So I really squeezed on timing, and so you can find me on LinkedIn. And I'm making this gonna be interactive. What do you see as the biggest challenge in the risk management? And what is your solution? How do you become part of that solution? And then I'm welcoming for comments and questions. Yes. Yes. Believe it or not, we're still ended up in the newspaper, right? And for Wells Fargo, we have global-wide, we have 260,000 employees global-wide. Simply for internal audit workshop, which is typically the smallest function in all three lines of defense, we have more than 1,500 employees in that department. And simply for the IT, we have nearly 500. And the work volume, and I'm still kind of having the, the meetings from 8 a.m. and 8:30 all the way to 4:30, and then my real day start after that. So work volume is a lot. So how do we really reduce the overhead from the internal workshop, and not avoiding looking at the same thing shallowly? And how do we really coordinate with each other to make sure those big items are not falling through the crack? And people are looking at that year after year, but nobody questions that we don't even have the roles and responsibilities laid out in the certain IT domain. Those are the things we're trying to resolve and trying to catch up the curve. So, yeah. Any other questions? No? Thank you so much.
It's an honor to present.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.